Hi, this is Bill Guesswich. Welcome back to Blazor WebAssembly Authentication mini-series. This is part 4, where we talk about the Blazor WebAssembly client setup and how to use authentication. So let's get started. Back in Visual Studio, let's take a look at the client now. This is the Blazor WebAssembly client, and we want to look at how you handle authentication within the Blazor client app. So the first thing I want to show, and this will be in the references section or in the description section, is the Microsoft documentation on ASP.NET Core Blazor Authentication and Authorization. And very specifically, we're going to come down here to the AuthenticationStateProvider service. We're going to talk about that and implementing that shortly. Now, I also want to note before we get into the code that recently Microsoft did release Blazor WebAssembly 3.2.0 Preview 2, which also contains some authentication. And I've started going through some of this, and a lot of it are components that do things behind the scenes, so I thought it made sense to still go through what I'm showing you today because it's at the next level of detail level. Microsoft has implemented some things that hide some of the implementation from you, which is a good thing ultimately, but I always am a big believer in understanding how things are working behind the scenes first, and then I can potentially use some of the higher level implementations. So I will put a reference to both of these documents in the description and you can read along, but I wanted to make sure that we still went through the plan that I had in place, even though Microsoft has released this recently. So first thing we want to do, as I mentioned in the documentation, is implement an authentication state provider. Now the thing I find is that sometimes things are called names that are a little intimidating, but actually at the end of the day, really all it is just the implementation of some code. So what an authentication state provider is just a set of code that when Blazor is looking to see am I authorized or not at the WebAssembly side, it's a section of code that gets implemented that passes back some information that says yes or no. And ultimately that's really what it is. And so let me start by going into the AppRaiser and looking at a couple of things that changed since once you implement authorization or authentication in your app. So the first thing, instead of having a route view component that kicks everything off in your app.raiser file, you do this authorization route view, and then it's pretty much the same after that. You are given a couple of things, which we'll talk a little bit about later. There's some other tags that you can put in place, not authorized, and this will happen if you're not authorized. So you can see here I implement a component called redirect to login. So if you're not authorized and you go to something that requires authorization, then it goes to the login. And then if you're authorizing, you will see the words authorizing here. And that's pretty much it from an app.raiser perspective. There are some other things that you can do. You can wrap this with a cascading state provider parameter and some other things like that. We won't get into those details, but that allows you to actually put code in place, procedural code in place that checks the authentication state of the application. But I've found a lot of these tags to be very, very useful. So I'm going to stay with the tags here. And if you're interested, just send me a note and let me know, and I'll be happy to talk through what a cascading authentication state parameter is and how to use it. Okay, so let's go over to services and let's go into API Authentication State Provider, a class that I created. I'll talk about what this SaveToken class at the top is in a second. But API Authentication State Provider implements or inherits from Authentication State Provider, and that's the Microsoft class that implements the authentication, and we have to override this method called getAuthenticationState. So we're overriding this method in order to get authentication working. So I implement I inherit from that, and I also implement this interface, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I wanted to get access to a couple of other things. So let's go down to get authentication state, async. So once we're here, first thing I want to talk about is I go and get token async. So I'm using, well, let's go down to get token async and I'll talk about it from there. So if I go down to get token async, which is a private method within this class, you can see that it gets the token from local storage. That local storage is a package that I've installed called Blazored.LocalStorage. So you want to make sure that you've loaded that package, and you will get access to local storage, the local storage feature. The other thing relative to that is you want to put in program CS. You want to make sure that you add Blazored local storage as a services within your program CS file, program class. All right, let's go back here. Now, before I go too far, right now that is not secure. We really want to make sure that that's secure local storage. This is the way, just to prove some things. Microsoft is working on a secure local storage class. It's still in alpha, so I didn't want to use it here. So I use this, but you can either decide that you want to store the token locally, or you can decide that you want to ask for one every time and just keep it local, and then once somebody gets out of the application, you're going to refresh it the next time. It's up to you. I chose to store it locally and use it that way, and so we can talk a little bit about that as we go through. So here I pull in the authorization token and I pull in the expiration token. So obviously, and we'll get to it, in order to be able to pull it in, we had to save it out, and you'll see that I do save it out into local storage in a little bit. So initially, this will be empty. So we're going to return a ParseToken, and ParseToken actually pulls in the token, pulls in the expiration date, and pulls in the claims data relative to the token as well, and then passes it back this thing called SaveToken. And I wanted to do this all at once and pull it in to this SaveToken class, which has claims, and then it has the login result that we saw on the server side as well as on the client side. But because we process claims a couple of times here, rather than go and parse the claims each time, I chose to put it in a routine at the end called ParseToken, and ParseToken uses this helper class, parse claims from the JWT, that I have to give credit to Steve Sanderson for, that parses the token and provides back a claims, basically an enumerable of a claim. So this here, which is a helper class within the client as well, parses the token and gives you back an enumerable of claims so that you have access to the claims. And we'll see how we use those in a little bit. So I parse the claims, I pull out the user ID from the claim, and then I come down here, create a save token, I pass in the claims to the save token, and then I give it a login result of the user ID that's equal to the user ID, the token, and the expiration date. And that is then used in the get token async, and that's what's returned from the get token async as a save token, which is of type, it's of type save token. And then up here, so that's the first step in the get authenticated state async. I know there was a lot to digest there, but essentially we are getting the token from the local storage and storing it in SaveToken. And then you can go through the code to get a better understanding of it. And if you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. So you get the token, you put it in SaveToken. the next thing is you check to see if the token itself is empty. So as I mentioned, the first time through, if nobody's logged in, the token's going to be empty. So you're going to get an empty string. I'll talk about this first time through a little bit later. And we return an authentication state with no claims associated with it, and that tells Blazor that it is not authorized at this point. So that's the way we say not authorized. And so if there is a token, and if the expiration date has not passed, because one of the things in get token, I should have mentioned that when we were there before, when we go to get the token or parse the token, if the token is expired, then, and we have this is a method we put in here as well, is token expired. If the token is expired, then we log out the user, and we'll talk about that in a second, and we pass back just an empty SaveToken. So we will, if there is no token, or if the token is expired, it's going to pass back an empty token, in which case it'll say it's not authorized. So now this next time is, we'll talk about this first time through again. That's really just, well, I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then if there is a token, that means it's authorized, so we'll pass back an authentication state and then pass back the claims that we received from the parsing. And that tells it that it's authenticated. Okay, so that is how we check authentication and not authentication. Now the one problem I found was if I logged in and then I logged out and then I went back to the site before the token expired, it detected that it was authenticated, but it didn't load users and stuff like that the way I wanted to. So that's why I put this first time through in place. So if the app runs for the first time and it's the first time through, if it's the first time through, I go and I mark the user as authenticated. Now what does that do? Well, what that ends up doing is marks the user authenticated, and I pass it a SaveToken. We'll talk about this one in a second. Okay, mark user authenticated. What does that do? Well, it establishes an authenticated user claims principal, which is this. It has the name identifier in there that has the user ID, because we want to definitely store that. It then says the authorization state is equal to task.fromResult, or a new authentication state with authenticated user. So it specifies an authenticated user here. So it's setting up the claim that says it's an authenticated user. It then stores the token and the expiration date. And then it sets the token in the generic repository. The generic repository, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is all of the API calls. And so that's what sets up the token for future API requests like get user and get users that we saw in Postman. And then it triggers an event that says notification authentication state changed, and it passes in the authentication state with a claim that has the user ID in it. So anybody who subscribes to that event can parse the claim and get the user ID and do something with it. So let's talk about that. Initially, I had some logic in here to load the current user, but I found because of separation and controls, it probably wasn't the best way to handle it. So we trigger this event, and then in another service called client user service, I subscribe to this event. So this is the auth provider, is the authentication state provider, which is what we were just looking at, has an event called authentication state changed. And when that gets kicked off, I do the authentication state changed, auth provider _ authentication state changed. I run that. So here we have this, here it is here, and what we do here is we look to see if it's authenticated. So that's the way we identify it. So we get an authenticated state task that comes in, and this is the way you look for whether it's authenticated. And then if it's authenticated, then we go and we load the claims from the task that gets sent in. We pull out the user ID from those claims passed in, and then we trigger our own event called user authenticated event, and we invoke that. And then what do we do there? Well, what we do there is there's a current user info class that has its own, in here it looks for the user authenticated event in the underscore user dependency injection service. And so that is underscore user, so it subscribes to that event. And when it subscribes to that event, it just populates this, it gets passed in the user ID, and it populates the user, which is going out into the API and pulling in the user. And I did this for separation of control. So looking at those three services here, just as we look at it over here, the API Authentication State Provider triggers an event that the client user service looks at, pulls out the user ID from the claims. I didn't want the current user class to be worrying about what a claim was. So this pulls out the claim and then invokes its own event that then passes the user ID to it. And so the current user info subscribes to that event, and when it receives it, it populates the user, or if it's empty, it clears the user. So you'll see when I log out, I either populate or I clear the user, and this class is injected and passed along to all of the different Razor components. So you can inject this into any component where you need to know who the current user is. And then this component has a property changed event that then will trigger when this changes. So something like the login menu in the upper right hand corner, when you log in and it says welcome Bill, welcome Fred, that gets changed. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. That'll subscribe to the event, this event, and when that changes, it'll update the login display there. So there's a lot to unpack there, but essentially this triggers an event that this subscribes to, this triggers an event that this subscribes to, and then this triggers an event that the UIs will respond to, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's go back here. You've got mark user as authenticated. We have that we just went through. And then mark user as logged out, and notice this is public. And the reason why I made this public and I made this public is because I want to have the login component be able to call into here, actually the service be able to call into here and do this work, again, from a separation of control standpoint. I didn't want the other services to worry about how to store and get and everything else. I just wanted it to know, hey, this guy's logged in, authenticate him. This guy's logged out, log him out. And that's why that's in here. And the logout just creates an empty claims principal. It's all empty. It removes the token and the expiration date. It sets the token to empty in the repository, so it won't send the bearer token. And then the notification, then it triggers the event, and it triggers it with no claims, so everybody knows that it's unauthorized, and then it will respond accordingly. So the client user service that responds to it, if it's not authenticated, it will invoke its own event. That event will say, nope, not authorized, there's no user ID, and then this current username when it responds to it, will say, oh, it's empty, and it will clear the user and clear user and populate user. So populate user just pulls the current user from the API and then triggers the event, and clear user just empties out the user, sets the counter to 0. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then it also triggers the property changed event. So that's what's going on. Let's go back here one more time. We talked about get token, ParseToken we talked about, and then is token expired. So while get authentication state async and implement authentication state provider is a lot of words, that's what it's essentially doing. And I know there were a lot of pieces there, but essentially what this is doing is it's providing its own logic to say, is somebody authorized or not? Because there can be multiple ways to do the authentication, you could log somebody in every time. And so since there's so many different ways of doing it, you have to implement this. Now, again, in some of the newer, in the preview 2 that just came out, some of this is hidden from you. If you subscribe to some of the components that Microsoft put out, then you don't have to do some of this. But I did want to show you this because this is what's going on behind the scenes. And I will take a look a little bit further. I started looking at the new preview, and I may put up an additional video that talks about implementing it kind of the version 3.2 preview 2 way as well. So stay tuned for that potentially, and if you really want me to do that, I'd be happy to do it, but I wanted to show you this first. That's the authentication piece here. A lot to unpack, but pretty straightforward once you kind of go through it a couple of times. So now let's go into the register page. So the register user page has, and let me run this for a second just so that you get a sense of what's going on. So as you can see, when I'm here, I'm in an unauthenticated state. The app is pretty empty. I log in, and from here, now I get these 2 tabs, and it says welcome bill up here and log out. So that's what's going on there. If I go to register and I register, let's just say I'm going to register Wilma Flintstone WF, and I'll leave the password and PASS 123 ? And we'll register. And what happens is you see welcome Wilma. It basically logs the user in once you click register. Okay, so let's take a look at that and what's going on there. You'll see a lot of similarities. I'm not going to go through the edit form. We've seen that before. The only thing I will note is what I found, I wasn't putting this component in some of my early versions. And because I had certain data annotation validations going on, I was seeing some very weird behavior. So make sure that you put these 2 items in your components when you're using edit form. And I should have done that to begin with, but I was looking at some early versions of things and I didn't, and I ran into a problem. So what this component does really is just, it looks to say if show registration. So if I'm to show this registration, show the form, and we've already shown you what that looks like. Otherwise, mention that it's registering. And I use the show registration, which is just a Boolean, set it to true initially, so it's going to load the registration form. And I'll set it to false once I've clicked register. So let's talk about that for a second. We've got a private user registration, this user. As I think we've talked about before, forms are not usually good if you don't initialize them, and depending on the timing of when it gets initialized, if you don't initialize it, sometimes you can run into some issues. So it's just best to always do this, even if you're going to go to a database and pull in some information. The information might not be down when the component gets loaded. So it's always good, this is best practice, to kind of do this. Make sure you don't get a null reference. So we define a user registration of this user, and then we use the form, and then each of the fields here is first name, last name, what have you. Okay. So here, if I go back up here on a valid submit, it's submit registration. This is submit registration. First thing we do is we use client service registered user. I'll go there in a second. I start the task here to get it running, and then I change show registration to false because that's going to update the UI. I wanted to start the background task first, so that's what I was doing here. And then I await that task because I do need to wait for the login result now. Once the login result comes back, if it's empty, I put show registration to true, and you will go back to the registration form, and otherwise we will navigate to the index. All right, so I just noticed that there's a typo there, so let me go ahead and navigation. Let me change that there, and that will cause an error down here, but I like everything to be good, so there we go. So we just switched that. So that's that. So now let's go to register user. Register user is part of iClient user service, and so let's go here to this, and register user goes to the generic repository. We're going to check that out in a second. It passes in a user registration, it gets back a login result, and it calls the API register that we saw before. And it passes the user registration that we're passing this. Once that's done, it calls the mark user as authenticated. And as long as we got a valid token back, it will go ahead and mark it authorized and do everything that we said before. This is why I wanted to define mark user authenticated in the interface. And once we do that, we return the login result to the caller. So let's go back, and we'll go back one more time. So the login result comes back here, and then that's what we check here. So that's, once it's done, it goes to the index, and we're good here. Let's take a look at the login razor. Does basically the same thing, show login. You know, here's the login information. It calls login user. The only thing that it does differently here is because login will get called, and I'll show you, if you remember from the app razor, what we did here was if it was not authorized, we call the redirect to login component. And the redirect to login component, all it does is add a query string for the return URL and with the return URI. So once you log in, it'll go back to the caller. So, and I'll show you some of that in a little bit. That's what this code up here is doing. It's pulling in the URI, it's looking at the query. If the query has a return URL, it's specifying it here. Then it does the same thing. It calls the client service, it sets show login to false. If it's a valid token, if it's not a valid token, it goes back and displays the login form. Otherwise, it will navigate either to the index if the return URL is empty, or it will go to the return URL here. So that's what's going on there. And then so a couple of other things. Let's go to the Nav menu. So as you may recall, the main layout is the main layout that got specified in the app razor file. So in app razor, we have a type of main layout. Main layout then loads Nav menu, which is the menu on the left. And Nav menu now will show it has this authorized view component that if it's authorized, it will show the counter and the fetch data. So that's how the counter and fetch data is being displayed. And if we go here, notice we've got these two. And if I log out, they go away. If I log in, we'll log in as Wilma again. There they are, and this brief survey. So I'm sure you can see now that over here in the index, let's go to the index. The index has an authorized view around the survey prompt. So that's how we're displaying and not displaying things. So one more thing I want to show you is let's go to the login display component. And just as a reminder, in the Nav menu, in the main layout, you have Nav Menu up here, and you have Login Display. If I run the app real quick, that login display is what shows in the upper right hand corner and is the welcome username that you see. Actually, not username, first name. So when I log in, so first of all, login display displays this, but when I log in, it also will display the name here as well with logout. So let's take a look at that. Login display, if I go over here to login display, what you'll see is another authorized view, authorized. So if it's authorized, we get welcome at current user first name, and we get logout. And if it's not authorized, you get login and register. Okay? The one thing that this does, as we mentioned before, in services, we have this current user info that has subscribed to the iProperty notified iNotify property changed interface. So in login display, it subscribes to that, and whenever the event is received, then we say state has changed. And we say state has changed because the value in current user has changed, and it may be that there is no more first name. It may not be that it's not authorized anymore, or and if in either case, you see it will either pull in the new first name if a new user logs in, or it'll show the login and register if there is no login. So I just wanted to show you that. We referenced that before, and I just wanted to make sure that we covered that as well. Now let's talk a little bit. As you saw in the Nav menu, I have the authorized wrapped around these two components. But in addition to that, you could put a authorized attribute at the top of any component. So I put the authorized attribute here on counter and here on fetch data. But I also only show it in the Nav menu if it's authorized. Now, I only show those menu options. Now, I did want to protect the components just in case you tried to get there somewhere else. But let's do one thing and see what happens now. If I go into Nav menu, and if I take the counter and I move it outside of that authorized view, now it's going to show when I am logged out. So let's stop the application. Let's rerun it, and let's see what happens here. All right, let's log out. Log out, notice we have home and counter just like we would expect. Counter takes us right to the login, and when I log in, I go to the counter. And that is because of, number one, because I moved it out, but I still had the component decorated with the authorized attribute. It said, oh, you're not authorized. And because in App Razor, I said if it's not authorized, go to redirect to login. And redirect to login said, here's the return URL, and let's go to login and pass it the return URL. And then login says, oh, okay, if I've got a return URL, then I go there. Otherwise, I go to the index file. So that's how, let me go back. So I get to the counter this way. If I log out and I go to log in and I log in, I go to the index file because I wasn't coming from somewhere, I was coming from the login. So that's how that's all working. Well, let me show you one other thing. Let's go into the generic repository. I just want to show you how the bearer token gets set. So as I showed you, whenever a user is authenticated in the API Authentication State Provider, I have the mark user as authenticated, and in there it sets the token. Set token is over here. I specify an internal variable called _token of type string. I set it to blank initially, and then all of my methods use this call API method. And in here, if the _token is empty, is not empty, I should say, I add a header authorization, bearer, space, and then the token, and that's exactly what we saw in Postman. So if it's not empty, it appends this to the request. The request goes up, and if the token's valid, it will respond with a 200. Otherwise, it will give you an unauthorized. If it gives an unauthorized, it triggers an exception, and the exception gets handled basically as clearing the, I basically log out the user and you have to start again. All right, so that is everything in here. In the next video, I'll show you how to use JavaScript to write out to the console, as well as do some debugging, and then carry that counter value across once you navigate to different pages. So thanks for watching. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. And as always, please reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. Thank you.